Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Hello, welcome to the show. In today's episode, I interviewed John Milano with RCM&D. John is a senior vice president with RCM&D and has been in the insurance industry for over 20 years. And RCM&D has been around since 1885, and they're one of the largest privately held insurance advisory companies in the United States. And I reached out to John because I wanted to find out what the questions a CIO needs to ask when buying a cyber insurance policy. Because as the CIO, you're now the data governor of your organization, and that data is slipping out through mobile devices, into cloud data centers, certainly within your own four walls. And I wanted to find out how the insurance companies look at that. We've got companies that are suffering from DDOS attacks. They're impacted continuously with different events related to cyber security issues. So John and I dive in deep on a variety of different scenarios and questions. So grab a legal pad because there's a lot of information in this episode. And I'm going to have some of it on the show notes for sure. So you can certainly refer to the show notes, but you're best going to be served by listening to the show a couple times, definitely with a legal pad. So let's get started. So John, I wanted to welcome you to the Red Zone podcast. I'm really interested in learning about the cyber insurance landscape as, all of my listeners are as well. And maybe you can tell me a little bit about sort of the history, like where have insurance carriers been like maybe 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, because you've been in this industry for so many years. And where are we right now with cybersecurity insurance?
Well, Bill, thank you again for having me, and thank you for the opportunity. I think there's been an evolution with this product and a learning experience that carriers have gone through. I think that they've brought on experts in the field to be able to educate them as to the pitfalls or exposures that their insureds may face. And they've gotten a little bit smarter as to the way that they price these products and also the coverages that they're extending to them. And those things also have been driven by the fact that there's more capacity, more carriers writing these coverages than ever before. It's in the news on a consistent basis. Obviously, the large ones on a weekly basis are out there, and so people are more aware about their own personal information, and then obviously the data breaches that happen on a corporate level and how it affects them. So it certainly is out there. It's been one of the fastest growing insurance products for insurance carriers and brokers alike. The awareness, specifically, some industries have a little bit more exposure and have been on the forefront of purchasing this insurance. And I think all insureds or all clients these days are looking at least to have the conversation as to what it's covering and what the cost will be for them.
So what is it from a broken windshield point of view or just a human life? There's a risk and a probability of any one of those two events happening that has probably been compiled over close to 100 years. How do you even begin to assess risk? So if a company approached you and said, I would like to buy coverage, how would you go through understanding what risk that particular company or industry represents?
I think it has a lot to do with the industry. And so within our clients, we have a number of industries that have heightened security because they are dealing directly with personal identifiable information or personal health information. So that would be healthcare organizations, financial services companies, education. You have alumni and students and all the information you have on them, as well as anyone who's taking any credit cards for their business. So all of those involved would be something that we would look at and say, well, you have more exposure than your normal store would or normal business. And so we would be talking to them about how many records do they have, and then bringing in, and this is a different conversation. This is a conversation that we hadn't had in the past, where we might be dealing with the CFO or the CEO of a company. Now we're dealing with the head of IT or the CIO of an organization. So it's certainly a different conversation, and bringing those folks in is a great education for, I think, everybody at their firm.
I agree with you, and I think the role of a CIO is really a governor role. It's morphing into a governor role because the data is essentially not within four walls anymore. It certainly would be within their four walls, but it's also on devices that employees are carrying in and out of their offices, and it's in cloud. It's in the cloud now, and so the CIO has to govern that risk. So how would they govern the risk of data moving outside, for example, the state of which their headquarters is located? So how would an insurance company approach the data that may be in California, but the headquarters may be in Maryland?
Right. So each state, or 47 out of the 50 states, have their own privacy regulations. And I think President Obama just recently came out with a bill that he would like to institute that would give some sort of national regulation on privacy notifications. The insurance companies, when looking at a risk, is going to be looking at what controls the client has in place and what service providers they're using and what due diligence has gone into bringing in those third-party vendors. So they're going to be looking at a number of different things. They have applications that they will do. Occasionally they will do conference calls to drill down on maybe some answers that weren't clear or that they wanted more information on. But in terms of across different states, I think the exposure there for the carriers is just the fact that each state has different laws that apply to privacy, and that the client has to adhere to those laws. So it's not necessarily where the client is based, it's where their customers are based, and they have to adhere to those state laws.
Okay, so when you buy a policy, it would basically cover data that may be within the entire organization, not necessarily in one state or another. The insurance company is covering the whole risk package, the whole risk profile. They are,
and internationally as well.
Now, are there things to look at within an insurance policy that vary, that one should be looking at when a CIO is approaching a carrier? Are there some key indicators? I'm sure some insurance companies are more sophisticated in this area than others, just like some companies focus more on life and health and disability than commercial coverage. Are there different things that would give someone an indication that, no, this is a company that's trying to hack together a cyber policy, insurance policy, versus a company that's really in this space?
Yeah, the answer is yes. There's a lot of new entrants into this field. I think when we are looking at insurance carriers to recommend to our clients, we're looking at ones that have a track record. We're really looking at ones that have gone through breaches before, and that's where the rubber hits the road, just like any other claim that an insurance company can face. You want that experience that they have in dealing with it, and then also their vendors that they contract out with in case of a breach. So we're representing dozens of carriers that provide this coverage, but I would say there's a handful that we recommend highly in terms of their experience, both in terms of understanding and the policy coverages, but also in dealing with claims. Each policy is different. Every wording is different, and each carrier will use different terminology. And so you really do need somebody who understands each of the policies to be able to explain that to a CIO to make sure that they understand what they're covered for and what they're not.
That's fascinating. So RCM&D, the company that you're with, so you're acting as essentially a broker, right? You have a specialist team of cybersecurity insurance people, and then you essentially look for carriers. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're a broker, so we're the intermediary between our clients and the insurance carriers. So we go out there and represent our clients and try to put them in the best light to the insurance carriers and negotiate the best terms and conditions for the best premium. We are always looking for coverage first. I think especially with the new entrants, I think you can get cheaper policy from anybody. But again, when you do have a claim, you want somebody that's going to respond appropriately. So we are looking for coverage first and not for the cheapest out there on the street.
So let's talk about, I've been bringing up this concept of a lot of companies right now, these breaches are turning into disaster recovery efforts, disaster recovery of reputation, managing customers' expectations and customer goodwill, and they're needing to continue their operations while they find the breach, find the damage impact. So it's not a crater in the ground disaster situation, but it is essentially a disaster that they have to run the business and mitigate and deal with the impact. How can insurance help that regard?
What most of the insurance carriers will do in terms of a breach is that they, first and foremost, when you buy a policy, there should be some onboarding call where your broker and the carrier will walk you through what to do in case of a breach. And who should be in that room? There should be risk management in that room. There should be the CIO in that room. There should be legal representation in that room so that all parties are aware of what to do in terms of a breach. What often happens is there'll be a knee-jerk reaction. We have to get out there and put this fire out before it starts, and it's a public relations nightmare. And oftentimes insureds or clients move too fast, especially even when they have insurance, that they might preempt some coverage for themselves and make things worse. So what the carriers do is they have vendors that they have worked with. There are some carriers that require that you use theirs, and I'll just use that as an example. So they'll have representation from a public relations, from computer consultants or forensic help, from a call center in terms of coaching you through what the notification laws are in each state and what would be appropriate. And they're trying to take that off your plate. I mean, it can be a huge distraction, but I think with the insurance, what you're paying for are these services when a breach happens. And it's really, really important.
I think that is critically important. I was just talking to a customer that their BCP, their business continuity planning consultant, was in helping them through tabletop exercises where they have these scenarios for disasters. And I said, well, I'm sure that they brought up the cybersecurity, probably was that number one. And they're like, no, they never mentioned it. I said, you got to be kidding me. Your comments are really important, John, because you mentioned legal, risk, the CIO. So the whole executive team is involved. And imagine if you could create that scenario ahead of time and say, no, in event of a cyber attack, here's how our insurance carrier is going to, here's what we would expect of them. Here's what our own team is going to do. Here's legal's involvement, is risk involvement. It seems to me that would be a very sound plan to have in place for any mature business out there.
Absolutely. A tabletop is great. You'll be surprised that you'll get a lot of introductions when people come into the room because they've either never met before or face-to-face, or maybe even never had interacted before. And they're part of a large company that if something were to happen, they would all need each other to be working in concert. So a tabletop exercise for a data breach or a cyber breach is critical for a larger company. And I know that insurance carriers are interested in working with companies to make that happen.
Now, from a CIO point of view, what should they be aware of that would negate their insurance coverage? Assuming, of course, you're representing a dozen carriers, so there's going to be sort of potentially going to be a generalized response from you. But what can they do to make sure that if the event happens, they do qualify for the insurance company to take notice?
So are you talking about just qualify for the insurance or when a breach actually happens?
Like when a breach happens, is there a chance that the insurance company would say, no, you were supposed to continue to do these things and you negated your coverage because you didn't? For example, if someone were to commit suicide on a life insurance policy, maybe the insurance company wouldn't pay out because they committed suicide versus natural causes, things like that. So is there something that applies on the cyber side that a CIO would have to make certain was in place as a continuous process so that the insurance company would be in a position to pay out?
Well, I think in terms of, what is represented in an application and discussions when the policy is first written, certainly there are representations made as to the controls that a firm would have in place and that they are adhering to these things. And those representations are certainly taken into account. I think the insurance carriers realize that human error is a big part of how and why data breaches happen. So I think that is built into it, and that's understood. But I believe if you misrepresent yourself, stating that you have certain controls in place and you don't have those controls in place, that could be an issue.
Okay, so they have to show due diligence, but neglect would be something different. But if they had
Correct.
the appropriate due diligence in place, that's what you'd be looking for. And of
Correct.
course, if there was neglect, that would be a different story.
Absolutely. And we've seen, just like with the cloud and other service providers, that a lot of clients will believe that they don't have liability because they've passed off these services to a third party, and that's not true. The fact is that the owner or the person who has the direct relationship with the client actually is responsible for that data. And so with that and the fact that a lot of third-party service providers don't give any kind of guarantees as to the data protection, it really does fall back on the client.
Interesting. Okay. So if I move my data, or part of my data, it's probably more often the case, I move part of my data into a cloud service provider and they provide me SAE 16 certification or whatever, triple certified document that says that they've been reviewed by a third party, that doesn't abdicate the customer responsibility for their data.
It doesn't. I think data security is a key benefit that the cloud provider would cite, right, as a part of their marketing efforts, because it can benefit the company not only able to invest significant resources in securing their data, but the organizations, unfortunately, they don't recognize that it is their responsibility to secure that data, and that like I mentioned, the cloud provider generally don't give guarantees that the security of the data stored in the cloud is secure. So
you're absolutely right. Yeah, we've seen that where their certification or their attestation is about the data center as it pertains to that organization's data, not necessarily to the 100 or 500 clients they have.
Right. And I think equally important is the fact that most statutes and regulations do hold the data owner responsible for any mismanagement of the data or breaches.
Mm-hmm. So it still is fairly tricky then so how would an insurance company respond to that if there's a leak, but it happens, it's the customer data in Maryland, but the cloud service provider is in Texas and they have a breach in Texas, but it impacts the client that's in Maryland? How would that play out just from a whiteboard kind of what-if scenario from an insurance perspective?
Okay, so our client, the insured, is in Maryland?
Yes, the client, the insured.
And the cloud service provider is in Texas?
Yes.
Well, if the breach happens, it really goes back to the laws of each state where there would be affected customers. So that could be, in any of those 47 states that have regulations. So it's not, again, that our client is in Maryland, it's where their customers are. They would have to deal with those statutes and regulations in the state where the customer actually is.
So if I am the CIO and I'm buying a policy, are there different, and this is another way of me asking that same question, is there different types of policies that I should be asking for? So for example, security and privacy, is there different media? Is there ways in which I can protect data that is it globally the data? So for example, are you looking at the data as it floats into mobile devices, as it comes out of the company through the internet, remote offices, the data that is going to a cloud service provider? Is it the whole data umbrella, or are you trying to ensure situations that may happen? So someone comes in and plugs in a USB and an employee steals data. That might be one situation. Another situation may be that a Trojan is inside the company that's siphoning data out without company knowing, and all of a sudden there's a breach that way. There's different situations that are employee-based, that are based on crime. Does the insurance company have different policies per situation, or is it just like an umbrella?
it is an umbrella that looks at all of those things, whether it's employee-driven or a phishing attack or malware or anything like that. This policy provides for coverage for those things. There are certain insuring clauses you have to look at. It's driven by an aggregate limit of liability, which is usually your liability limit specifically. And then there are other sublimits that are built into the policy. And I think one of the things that CIOs need to look at is to what those other coverages, what those other insuring clauses are covering, and can you maximize those or get full limits for those things. And that would be, legal and forensics and public. I think we mentioned, publicity and cyber extortion and regulatory coverage. So all of those things go into a policy. And as I mentioned, that each carrier has their own separate policy with different wording. So it does take a little bit to understand what each carrier is classifying in terms of their insuring clauses and what coverages you do have and what you don't have.
Yeah, I find it fascinating because one particular client of ours has 50,000 members or customers, I guess, and this is a credit union, so they call them members. And he was saying that if they have a breach, they have to notify 50,000 members, and the postage on that is, I don't know what stamps are these days, $1 and change. And they have to send a notification out twice. Then they got to buy identity coverage insurance, and then they have to, the senior team has got to have ungodly amount of time meeting, and because they never had a tabletop exercise about it. So would the insurance company come in and help with that expense? Because that's significant.
That's absolutely part of it. And what you would look for in that, some carriers will actually take those costs, so notification, maybe credit monitoring, PR, forensics, they actually will take that and put it outside your limit of liability so it won't erode your liability limit. And what we've seen is that those costs are actually the highest. The notification and credit monitoring and forensics are actually the highest cost that we see in terms of the claims. So that would be one thing to look at. The other part to look at would be that some carriers will actually, instead of giving you a pot of money to say you can use X amount of dollars to do these notifications and forensics and everything, they'll actually do a number of affected customers. So they may say, instead of giving you $1 million to spend on notification, they may say you have 1 million affected customers that you can respond to.
Interesting.
And they would assist you in those letters, getting those letters out, having a call center. That's a huge deal because people are going to start calling in and saying, well, I saw that there was a breach. What are you doing about this? And companies are not prepared to be able to field those type of questions, and having a separate insurance policy that would provide for a call center would be really important to make sure that they're able to do their business appropriately while this is going on.
Oh, yeah. See, that's where it's at. The companies, this is where it's fascinating, is that companies have to keep working. They have to keep making money and keep working, and they still at the same time have to deal with the customer response, and they've got their IT teams that are dedicated to keeping the trains running, but now they've got to hire a whole team to come in there and find and root out the malware that is designed not to be found. I mean, if it was so easy to find, they would have found it. So that's interesting as well. Is there anything that would help with, let's say it took a forensics team or a specialized IT security team to come in and find the damage, maybe it cost $100,000. Is there policies to help with that?
Yeah, that's part of the policy built in.
Okay.
Those forensics are built into one of the insuring clauses. And that would be a cost of, like I've said, that's where we see a lot of the cost going towards in terms of finding the breach and being able to stop it.
I would imagine that is a huge, huge piece. And it's very practical as well. These are like practical pieces to cover because we just know it's going to happen, that we're going to need this coverage. Because certainly I don't find many IT teams are overstaffed at the moment. So to have this event happen, you can just see the practical, you're going to need to hire a team to come in and figure this out. And your team's going to need to support the current business. And the call center is another piece. It's like your call center is there for your existing customers, not necessarily to handle double the call volume, to find out about, to address questions in a professional way due to a breach.
That's right.
Now, what I'm fascinated about as well is I was talking to my CTO, was talking to one of your team members about the cyber extortion. And that's interesting because that's come up even with Sony, in the Sony hack, is and this is not just Sony, but they were asked to pay an extortion fee. And so, but in some respects, a DDoS attack can be seen as that as well. If you DOS a bank or a credit union or insurance company or to interrupt their business, how does an insurance company respond to that?
So it's pretty key because there are some coverages that are not necessarily part of each insurance company's policy. You may have to ask for it, and cyber extortion is one of those coverages that may not just be included. You may have to ask for it. So again, it's good to have somebody speaking with you about what to ask for and what is sort of a hot topic in terms of some of the insuring clauses. So cyber extortion is certainly part of it. The other one would be network interruption.
Oh, okay.
So you have an instance where someone has taken down your system and you're not able to operate and you're not able to do business. And that's something that we normally see in a property policy. So if there's a property loss and you're not able to operate based on covered cause of loss, then there would be some coverage in terms of business interruption. And this would be similar in terms of network interruption.
Yeah, again, another really practical, the chances of interruption due to a hurricane is small in comparison to a network interruption. I mean, that's just happening with so many businesses now, with our clients and with others. So I can see that would be a really practical, and I can see why every insurance company wouldn't necessarily take that risk on, but it would be important for the CIO to ask that question.
Right. Absolutely.
What are some other items that a CIO you feel should be asking if they had your brain? So if they had your expertise and they knew what to ask you, what would they be asking in a first meeting?
I think that they'd want to ask, what are the coverages available to me? And then we would go through each of those insuring clauses to see which ones were most applicable to them. There's a cost associated with those things, but oftentimes, again, you have to ask for those things. You have to be aware of certain exclusions that may be there, whether or not there's an exclusion for regulatory matters. Obviously, we're seeing the government get more involved these days in compliance audits and things like that. So I would be concerned about that. PCI fines and penalties. So if you're taking any credit cards, you got to make sure that you have coverage for those penalties that come with PCI. I would also look to make sure that there's no unencrypted mobile devices exclusion. There are some carriers that maybe I know they ask a question whether or not mobile devices or laptops are encrypted, and it happens to be a frequent cause of loss is a lost or stolen laptop or mobile device. So that would be a question that would be on an application that you'd want to make sure that there was an exclusion for unencrypted mobile devices.
Now, are they literally breaking it down to, encrypting a laptop, not such a big deal, but are they savvy enough, the insurance carriers, to bring it down to whether or not people are delivering data to Apple devices, Droid devices? Do they care about how data is being delivered via virtualization methods or via other methods? Does it get down to that level?
I think they asked the question, I think with the bring your own device being pretty prevalent these days, people using their own devices, I think that creates more exposure. So I think that they're asking more questions. I would put it that way.
Interesting. So the insurance industry is needing to really kind of jump into high gear. I would imagine the insurance industry is normally fairly cumbersome and laborious. They're sort of lagging. I don't know how they can lag and still take on this. It seems like there's a bit of momentum built up for them to be really astute about these issues. Are you seeing that?
I do, and you're correct. Insurance being usually behind in terms of addressing new exposures, laws and regulations and sort of trends and court cases. But I would say that this is a little bit different product. I think because it is so new and there's so much publicity around it that insurance carriers have brought in experts. they contract with outside vendors to make sure that they are up to speed with the different scenarios and different exposures that their clients may be facing. And in terms of these loss mitigation services that they may offer and charge for and that are available out in the marketplace, they're certainly looking for their clients' insureds to look at those things and try to become a better risk before they actually buy the insurance.
So what I'm hearing you say is that they're much more savvy about the granularity of the data exposure and developing, and so the CIOs need to really look at the exclusions very closely. And if you are under any sort of HIPAA regulations, you have to look at that very closely, PCI. And is the insurance carrier highly concerned about companies that are under heavy HIPAA or PCI? Is that something that you find a big concern for them?
It is. They underwrite to that. Okay. So they identify, certain industries that are more highly regulated and that their exposure may be higher. So they will underwrite to that. It doesn't preclude them from offering coverage. It's just that they may address it with higher premiums or higher deductibles.
Wow. So I'm quite interested in this because I didn't think that a technical interruption caused by a cyber attack or a DDoS attack, or I didn't realize that the insurance companies had come up with policies or coverage offerings in that area. I think that that's incredibly useful for a CIO or an IT leader.
Absolutely. I mean, they're about keeping their business running and making sure that their customers are happy. And one of the ways that companies certainly can continue to work or continue to operate is by purchasing an insurance policy. I don't think they should rely solely on the insurance, but I think it's something that, along with their due diligence and the services provided by their own staff and outside service providers, get them to where they need to be.
Well, I'm definitely on the show notes going to put information about yourself and RCMD so that people can reach out to you to get help in this area. But before we wrap up the show for today, can you tell us any other unique ways in which RCMD can help in this regard with the CIO or a business leader that reaches out to you to start getting counsel in cybersecurity insurance area?
I think the most important part about working with a broker is making sure that they understand your business. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to assess your risks. And so what we would do is make sure that we meet with those CIOs, CFOs, legal counsel to be able to identify what's the operation about and what are the pitfalls or what are the exposures that they face that could slow them down or stop their business altogether. And certainly a discussion about cyber privacy liability is something that's in the forefront of a lot of companies' minds. So we're happy to discuss that and the trends that are out there and the services provided by the insurance carriers and outside providers, not only after a breach, but certainly before it.
Yeah, so this is clearly a situation in sort of like life insurance. The only time you need life insurance is when you're too sick to get it or you're dead.
Right.
I guess the only time to be talking about cybersecurity insurance is before you need it.
I think the fact is that I sort of equate this a little bit like employment practices was 20 years ago, where most people hadn't had claims for harassment or discrimination or something like that, but it wasn't if, it was when. And I sort of see the same thing with this cyber. It's not if, it's when.
Oh, without a doubt. There's no such thing anymore as people, at least if you're a fully functioning adult. These products, these hacking tools are designed not to be found. So just because you haven't found it doesn't mean you have them. And very large companies are being hacked, very sophisticated companies with dedicated staffs. So for the small to medium business, which are the majority of American business, they need to take notice. And I think also it changes your whole philosophy. When you assume you are currently breached, you approach security entirely different. You actually approach it from a point of view in which you start looking at mitigating that risk through insurance, but also it changes your whole approach to finding tools that instead of building a castle, you just assume they're in the castle. So you point your tools to finding all of the motion and the inappropriate behavior within the castle. So It's not to say you abdicate the moat and the drawbridge. You still need that as well, but you sort of open your eyes to saying, okay, this is a rough world we're in. Let's turn our eyes where they need to be. And
you brought up something that jogged my memory a little bit, and that would be the fact that a lot of these breaches, it's not determined that a company has a breach. It may have been going on for months before, maybe even years before it's detected. And that would be something that, in terms of if you're a first-time buyer of this insurance, to make sure that you do have full prior acts, and that would be important because you may go into this, and there are some carriers that will say you have coverage from this time going forward. Well, the fact is that there may be breaches that the client is not aware of, and they buy some coverage and then identify it after the fact. Now, the insurance company doesn't want to insure a burning building, so if you know of something, obviously they're not going to end up covering that. But if down the road you bring in some outside service providers and they do an audit and they find something, you may not have coverage if you didn't have that prior acts built in.
Well, that's interesting. That's almost like a pre-existing condition. It's almost like giving a life insurance to someone without, or they know they have cancer and they don't divulge it on the exam.
Well, it's not as much about divulging, because I think the fact is that, like I mentioned, some of these breaches are not known. So, yes, if you know about it, obviously they're not going to cover that. But if it's something that is not known and then it's detected down the road, but it actually started before you incepted your first policy, you want to make sure that you have coverage for that.
Oh, I see. So you can just ask, listen, I don't want this starting January 20th. I would like to backdate it, almost like backdate it.
At least, well, your inception date might be, the 20th, but you want to make sure that you have, acts that happened before, breaches that happened before that you're just not aware of.
Oh, that's a huge point. That is a really important point. Okay. Right, because you have to assume that you are, if you're assuming you are breached, then you need to ask the question, right, well, how far back can you go with this? Now, do you ever send your own team, or does the insurance company actually ask to do an assessment, or they require the company do a security assessment beforehand? Does that ever come up?
It usually does not. There are certain questions on the application that may require some explanation. So if there are certain questions that are answered no in terms of some controls that the company may have or may not have, I think that they would ask more questions about it. They're not necessarily coming in and saying they would require an audit or something like that, or a review.
Well, John, I've really appreciated you coming on my show today, and it's been very educational and enlightening for me, and I'm sure everybody else as well. As we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to say?
No, thank you again. I appreciate the opportunity. Certainly, I would encourage all the companies to look into this coverage, both large and small. There's certainly small companies that don't have the IT capacity to be able to handle these things by themselves, but there is insurance coverage out there. For most, I haven't seen a lot of customers be rejected completely. So I would say there's a policy out there. It may cost a little bit more based on the controls that you do or don't have, but I would encourage people to look into this coverage.
And they can find you and your organization at rcmd.com. Is that the best
Correct.
way?
That's the best way.
rcmd.com. Great, John. So there you have it, everybody. That wraps up my show with John Milano regarding IT cybersecurity insurance. What a fascinating topic. It's a topic that I get asked continually about these days, so I hope you enjoy the information that you heard. Please go to iTunes and let me know your comments on iTunes. iTunes uses this to gauge the show's popularity and the show's quality, so it would really help out a lot if you went there. And also, I want to thank our sponsor, Red Zone Technology, for world-class IT security assessment services and IT security managed services. So this is Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast signing out for today. Thank you. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcasts. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time,
I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.